These are players who are talented, but for different reasons, the league just isn't lining up for them anymore. And Brandon Ingram is pretty much the face of this whole problem, because when you first look at Brandon Ingram, he looks exactly like the type of player every team should want. He's long, athletic, can create his own shot, averages over 20 a game almost every season, and has one of the smoothest scoring styles in the league. For years, people compared him to Kevin Durant because visually, the similarities were obvious. And honestly, Ingram did turn into a very good player. After those rough early Lakers years, where he looked skinny, raw, and inefficient, he completely broke out in New Orleans. He won Most Improved Player, became an All-Star, and started putting up numbers that made it feel like the Pelicans had finally found their franchise wing scorer. But over time, something weird happened. Even though his stats stayed strong, the league slowly became less interested in him, and it comes down to the type of player Brandon Ingram actually is. See, Ingram is very isolation heavy. He likes operating with the ball in his hands, slowing the game down, working in the mid-range, and creating difficult shots. That style can absolutely work if the player is good enough. We've seen legends dominate that way before. The issue is that Ingram doesn't give you enough outside of that role. He's not an elite off-ball player. He's not constantly cutting or relocating. He's not the type of wing that naturally fits next to every star in the league. And because of that, building around him becomes more difficult than his raw numbers suggest. The Zion-Williamson pairing exposed this perfectly. On paper, Zion and Ingram should have been terrifying together. One guy collapsing defenses at the rim, the other scoring from everywhere else. But instead, the offense often looked awkward. A lot of possessions turned into your turn, my turn basketball, where both guys were taking turns attacking instead of elevating each other. And while Zion definitely has his own issues, people started realizing that Ingram's style wasn't exactly easy to maximize either. Then there's the health concerns. At this point, teams almost expect Brandon Ingram to miss a chunk of every season. Ankle injuries, finger injuries, concussion protocol, blood clot concerns. It's always something, and front offices care about reliability just as much as talent now. Because if your max player misses 20 to 30 games every year, the entire team suffers. Rotations change constantly, chemistry gets disrupted, and playoff positioning gets harder. And then came the playoffs. When New Orleans faced Oklahoma City, there was a real chance for Ingram to prove he could carry more offensive responsibility. Without Zion, instead, it became one of the worst playoff stretches of his career. He struggled badly against physical defense, looked uncomfortable, creating efficient offense, and the Thunder completely shut him down. That series hurt his reputation a lot more than people realize. Because suddenly, teams started asking a dangerous question. If Brandon Ingram needs the ball this much, misses games this often, and still hasn't proven he can lead elite playoff offense, is he actually worth building around? And that question became even louder once New Orleans traded him. For a player with his talent level, the return package felt surprisingly weak. That's when it became obvious the market around the league simply wasn't that aggressive for him. Not because he's bad, but because modern NBA teams value scalability more than ever. Teams want stars who can fit next to other stars, move without the ball, defend multiple positions, stay healthy, and adapt to different systems. And Ingram still plays more like a traditional isolation scorer from an older era. He's talented enough to put up huge numbers, but not quite versatile enough for teams to comfortably hand him the keys to everything. That's why Brandon Ingram is such a weird player to evaluate. Because if you only watch highlights, he looks incredible. The handle, the footwork, all of it screams superstar talent. But once teams start thinking about contracts, playoff fit, durability, and roster construction, the excitement cools off really fast. And that's why one of the most naturally gifted scorers in basketball somehow ended up becoming one of the strangest trade value players in the league. John Collins is one of the best examples of how quickly NBA value can disappear once the perfect situation goes away. Because there was a time where this dude genuinely looked like one of the future stars at power forward. Back in Atlanta, Collins looked like the ideal modern big man. He could run the floor, catch lobs, stretch the court, and finish everything around the rim. At just 21 years old, he was averaging almost 20 points and 10 rebounds while shooting efficiently from everywhere. And next to Trae Young, it looked perfect. Trae was collapsing defenses in pick and rolls, Collins was flying to the rim for lobs, and Atlanta's offense suddenly became one of the most exciting young systems in basketball. For a while, Collins looked untouchable. Then reality slowly kicked in. The Hawks changed personnel, Clint Capella arrived, spacing got tighter, and Collins started losing the easy opportunities that made him so dangerous. Instead of constantly attacking open lanes, he was sharing the paint more often and getting pushed into a smaller role offensively. That's when people started realizing something important. John Collins wasn't really creating offense for himself. A lot of his success depended heavily on the system around him. Now that doesn't mean he's bad. There's still massive value in athletic bigs who can finish plays and stretch the floor, but when you're getting paid star-level money, teams expect you to create advantages on your own sometimes too, and Collins struggled there. He's not a great shot creator, not a great ball handler, and defensively, he never became the versatile stopper people hoped he would become early on. Then came the injuries. The finger injury especially seemed to completely mess with his shooting for a while. Before that injury, he was becoming a very reliable three-point shooter. After it, his percentages dropped hard, and suddenly one of his biggest strengths became inconsistent. That's when Atlanta fully moved on. And honestly, the trade package shocked people. For a player who averaged near 20 and 10 in his prime years, the Hawks basically gave him away just to clear salary. That told you everything about how the league viewed him at that point. Then Utah took the chance, and to Collins' credit, he actually played better again there. His efficiency improved, the athleticism still looked good, and he quietly started rebuilding some value. But even then, teams still weren't rushing to trade for him. Why? Because modern NBA teams are extremely careful about paying role-dependent players huge money. If Collins is next to elite creators in spacing, he looks amazing. But if the fit gets awkward, his impact drops fast. And front offices know that now. That's why his value became so strange. The talent is obvious, the athleticism is obvious. But teams no longer view him as a centerpiece. They view him as a complementary player who only works in certain environments. And once the league labels you that way, your trade value changes permanently. Lauri Markkanen is one of the weirdest stars in basketball because literally every team should want a player like him. A 7-footer who can shoot, score at all 3 levels, move without the ball, and fit next to stars sounds almost impossible to find in today's NBA. And honestly, Markkanen became exactly that. After struggling to fully break out in Chicago and Cleveland, he exploded in Utah. Suddenly, he looked like one of the best scoring forwards in basketball. Efficient shooting, huge scoring nights, strong rebounding, and the type of offensive versatility every modern team dreams about. So naturally, people started expecting him to get traded to a contender. Except it never happened. And the reason is complicated. Because Lauri Markkanen isn't unwanted due to talent. He's unwanted because of cost. Utah values him like a franchise player. Teams around the league probably view him more as an elite second option. That difference completely changes negotiations. Danny Ainge reportedly wanted massive trade packages for him, multiple first-round picks, plus young talent. And once his contract extension kicked in, things became even harder financially. Now, teams aren't just trading for Markkanen the player. They're trading for a gigantic long-term contract too. And while Lauri is very good, most front offices don't think he's good enough to completely reshape their salary cap around. That's the problem. He's too talented to be cheap, but not dominant enough for teams to comfortably treat him like a true franchise centerpiece. Then there's the health concerns. He's had multiple injury issues throughout his career and still hasn't played a truly full, healthy season in years. For a player making that level of money, teams want reliability, especially contenders. Because once you're deep into luxury tax territory, every move has to be perfect. And despite all the positives Markkanen brings offensively, there are still questions defensively too. He's not a defensive anchor. He's not carrying a defense by himself. So if you build around him, you still need elite defenders around him to balance everything out. That's why teams hesitate. Not because Lauri isn't good, but because trading for him requires committing enormous assets and money to a player most teams still see as a secondary star rather than a true number one option. And honestly, that's what makes his situation fascinating. Because if basketball was only about skill, almost every team would love to have him. But modern roster building is about contracts, fit, timelines, flexibility, and risk. And once all those factors enter the conversation, Markkanen suddenly becomes much harder to acquire than fans realize. Kristaps Porzingis is probably one of the biggest what-if players of the last decade, because when he first entered the NBA, he genuinely looked like the future of basketball. A 7'3" player shooting deep threes, protecting the rim, handling the ball, and moving like a wing felt completely unreal at the time. Knicks fans booed him on draft night because they didn't trust another international prospect, but within a couple years, Porzingis looked like a superstar in the making. He was blocking shots, stretching defenses, scoring from everywhere, and doing things that players his size simply were not supposed to do. For a while, he looked untouchable. Then the injuries started. And unfortunately, they never really stopped. The ACL tear completely changed the trajectory of his career. After that came more knee issues, calf problems, foot concerns, conditioning issues, and random stretches where he just couldn't stay healthy long enough to build momentum. And with a player that tall, teams immediately get nervous. Because once huge players start stacking lower body injuries, history usually isn't very kind. Still, teams kept betting on the upside. Dallas traded for him hoping he could become Luka Doncic's co-star. On paper, it sounded perfect. Luka controlling the offense while Porzingis stretched the floor and protected the rim, but the fit never fully worked. Part of it was health, part of it was chemistry, and part of it was that Porzingis wasn't moving the same anymore after the injuries. Instead of looking like an unstoppable unicorn, he slowly started looking more like a very talented but fragile scorer. And that became the theme of his career. Whenever he's healthy, he's incredibly valuable. He can protect the paint, punish mismatches, shoot over defenders, and completely change spacing offensively. There aren't many players in the world who can do all of that at his size. That's why Boston still wanted him. And honestly, when healthy, he helped them a lot. His ability to stretch the floor next to Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown made Boston even harder to guard. But even there, the same problem showed up again. He couldn't stay on the floor consistently. During the playoffs, Boston often looked like they were managing injuries with him every other week. And while they still won, teams around the league noticed something important. Boston didn't actually need Porzingis to survive, which is dangerous for his value. Because now, front offices start wondering if it's really worth paying huge money for someone who might only be available part-time. That's the biggest issue with Porzingis now. It's not talent. Nobody questions the talent. The issue is that teams don't trust his body anymore. And honestly, it's understandable. At this stage of his career, every season feels like a gamble between all-star level impact and missing months with another injury. That's terrifying for teams trying to compete for championships. Especially with the new salary cap rules, once you commit massive money to a player, flexibility disappears fast. And if that player can't stay healthy during playoff runs, the risk becomes almost impossible to justify. That's why Porzingis has become one of the strangest players in the NBA to evaluate, because skill-wise, he's still incredibly unique. But availability matters almost as much as ability now. And unfortunately for Porzingis, the league no longer believes those two things come together consistently anymore. D'Angelo Russell has had one of the weirdest careers in modern basketball. Because every few years, it feels like people convince themselves he's finally figured everything out, and then the exact same problems come back again. When D'Lo first entered the league, the expectations were huge. He was supposed to become one of the next great offensive guards after Kobe retired. The Lakers drafted him second overall, and people loved the flashy passing, the confidence, and the scoring upside. But even early on, there were warning signs. He struggled with efficiency, wasn't very athletic, and defensively, teams attacked him constantly. Eventually, the Lakers moved on. Then Brooklyn happened, and honestly, this was the best stretch of his career. With the Nets, D'Lo became an all-star, controlled the offense beautifully, hit tough shots, and looked like one of the best young guards in the East. For a moment, it felt like he had finally become the player everyone expected. But the deeper teams looked, the more they realized something important. D'Angelo Russell only really thrives when the entire offense revolves around him. Once he has to share responsibilities with bigger stars, the weaknesses become much more noticeable. That's exactly what happened later in his career. Whether it was with the Lakers, Minnesota, or other situations, D'Lo struggled anytime he wasn't the primary creator. His scoring became inconsistent, his shot selection became frustrating, and playoff defenses completely exposed him multiple times. The Western Conference Finals against Denver was probably the biggest example. The Lakers desperately needed scoring next to LeBron and Anthony Davis, but Russell completely disappeared offensively. His confidence dropped, his efficiency collapsed, and eventually he got benched during the series. That moment hurt his reputation badly because teams already knew about the defensive issues. They already knew about the inconsistency. But once you also become unreliable in the playoffs, contenders start backing away fast, and defensively things only get worse. D'Lo simply doesn't move like elite guards. He's not explosive enough to constantly create separation, and because of that, he relies heavily on difficult jump shots. When those shots fall, he looks amazing. When they don't, he can become a huge liability. That's why teams struggle valuing him highly, because on some nights, D'Lo looks like a gifted offensive guard, capable of dropping 30 points effortlessly. And on other nights, he looks borderline unplayable against serious playoff defenses. That inconsistency has followed him his entire career. At this point, most teams no longer view him as a cornerstone player. They view him as a secondary scorer or sixth-man type guard who can occasionally explode offensively. And honestly, that's probably the correct role for him now. Because while D'Angelo Russell still has talent, the league has already decided that talent alone isn't enough anymore if the flaws constantly show up when games matter most. Malik Beasley isn't a superstar, but his situation might honestly be the craziest one on this list. Because from a basketball perspective, teams should absolutely want a player like him. The NBA today is built around shooting. Every contender wants floor spacers, movement shooters, and guys who can instantly heat up from three-point range. And Beasley does exactly that. Last season was arguably the best year of his career. He shot over 40% from deep, provided instant offense, and looked like one of the better bench scorers in basketball. He fit perfectly with Detroit's young core, and it genuinely felt like he was about to secure another strong long-term contract. Then everything fell apart almost overnight. The gambling investigation completely destroyed his market, and the timing could not have been worse. Reports started surfacing about suspicious betting activity connected to prop bets involving Beasley games, specifically rebound lines that drew unusual betting attention. Even though details were still unclear, the headlines alone were enough to scare teams away immediately, because modern NBA teams are terrified of scandals like this, especially now that sports betting is tied so heavily into the league itself. The second gambling investigations get attached to a player's name, front offices start thinking about PR disasters, league attention, media pressure, and potential suspensions before they even think about basketball. And unfortunately for Beasley, this wasn't even the first off-court controversy tied to him. Earlier in his career, he dealt with legal issues involving threats of violence and even served jail time. There were lawsuits involving finances, management disputes, and other smaller controversies stacking up too. So once the gambling story appeared, teams immediately became cautious. Because even if Beasley can still help offensively, organizations start asking themselves if the potential drama is worth it. And honestly, that's brutal for a player like him. Because skill-wise, he absolutely belongs in the league. Shooters like Beasley are incredibly valuable. He can completely swing games when he gets hot, and teams constantly search for role players who can create spacing around stars. But reputation matters a lot in today's NBA. The second teams think distractions might follow a player, value drops instantly. That's exactly what happened here. Instead of entering free agency with momentum, Beasley suddenly became radioactive around the league. Teams that probably would have offered multi-year deals started waiting cautiously instead. And now his future feels weirdly uncertain, despite coming off one of his best offensive seasons. That's what makes his situation so unfortunate. Because unlike some other players on this list, Beasley's value didn't collapse due to aging, injuries, or declining talent. It collapsed because teams became nervous about everything happening outside of basketball. And until the investigation fully clears up, that fear probably isn't going away anytime soon. CJ McCollum has been one of the most consistently underrated scorers of his generation. For years in Portland, he was the perfect running mate next to Damian Lillard. Smooth jumper, great footwork, clutch shot making, and one of the steadiest offensive guards in basketball. And somehow, despite averaging over 20 points for basically a decade, he never even made an all-star team. That alone tells you how weirdly overlooked his career has been. But now, at this stage of his career, the conversation around McCollum has changed completely, because while he can still score, the league itself has changed around him. The NBA today is faster, more athletic, more defensive-minded, and far more focused on versatility. Teams want guards who pressure the rim constantly, defend multiple positions, and create chaos in transition. CJ doesn't really play that style. He's more methodical, more mid-range focused. more half-court oriented. And while that still works offensively sometimes, teams don't really want to build around that type of player anymore unless they're truly elite. That's where McCollum's value gets tricky. He can absolutely help teams offensively. He still shoots at a high level, still creates his own shot well, and still has moments where he looks like one of the smoothest scorers in the league. But defensively, things become difficult. CJ has never been a great defender, and now that he's older, those weaknesses stand out even more. In New Orleans, Herb Jones and Trey Murphy helped cover a lot of those problems defensively. But once injuries hit the roster, the team's defense completely collapsed, and that exposed how difficult it can be to build around offense-first guards who don't bring much defensive value anymore. Then there's the health concerns. Collapsed lungs, foot injuries, ankle problems, back issues. McCollum has dealt with a lot physically over the years. And at 34 years old, teams know the decline phase could happen at any moment. That's why his trade value quietly dropped, not because he suddenly became bad, but because teams no longer view him as a major long-term piece. They view him more as a veteran scorer, mentor, and locker room leader. And to be fair, he's excellent in that role. He's respected across the league, serves as the president of the Players Association, and has built a reputation as one of the smarter veterans in basketball. That matters, especially for younger teams. But from a pure basketball standpoint, there are simply younger, cheaper, and more athletic guards entering the league every year that can replicate parts of his production. And unfortunately, once teams start thinking that way, value drops fast. That's where CJ is now. Still productive, still respected, still skilled, but no longer viewed as someone teams are desperate to commit major money or assets toward. He's become one of those veterans where everybody likes him, but nobody really wants to build around him anymore. Bradley Beal might be the perfect example of how a contract can completely destroy a player's reputation. Because there was a time where Beal was viewed as one of the best scorers in basketball. In Washington, this dude was averaging over 30 points per game. He made all-NBA teams, carried huge offensive loads, and looked like one of the league's elite shot creators. Even after John Wall's injuries completely changed the Wizards, Beal still kept producing massive numbers. And eventually, Washington rewarded him with a gigantic contract, 5 years, around $250 million, plus a no-trade clause. At the time, people already thought the deal was risky. But once Phoenix traded for him, everything got even worse. Because suddenly, Bradley Beal went from being the #1 option on his own team to becoming the third isolation scorer next to Kevin Durant and Devin Booker. And immediately, the fit looked awkward. The Suns already had 2 players who needed the ball constantly. Adding another expensive shot creator who wasn't known for defense, playmaking, or off-ball versatility just created more overlap offensively. And to make things worse, Beal couldn't stay healthy. That became one of the biggest frustrations during his Phoenix run. Every few weeks it felt like Beal was dealing with another injury, another absence, or another stretch where the Big Three barely played together. So not only was Phoenix paying an unbelievable amount of money for their core, they also weren't even getting consistency from it. Then came the production drop. In Washington, Beal looked like a franchise scorer. In Phoenix, he suddenly looked normal. The numbers dropped hard, the impact felt smaller, and because his salary was still enormous, fans started focusing on every bad game way more aggressively. That's the danger of massive contracts in the NBA. Once you get paid superstar money, people expect superstar impact every single night, and Beal simply wasn't giving Phoenix that, especially in the playoffs. The Suns looked completely broken offensively at times. There was no real chemistry, no real balance, and no identity defensively. Meanwhile, Beal was making around $50 million a year, while often looking more like a secondary or tertiary scorer. That's when his value around the league completely collapsed, because teams weren't just evaluating Bradley Beal, the player, anymore. They were evaluating Bradley Beal, the contract, and financially he became almost impossible to move. The no-trade clause made things even worse because Phoenix had almost no flexibility once things started failing. They were locked into this expensive roster construction, whether it worked or not. And eventually, the situation became so bad that Phoenix basically had no choice but to move on. That's insane when you think about it. A player who averaged 30 points not that long ago suddenly became viewed as one of the worst contracts in basketball. Not because he forgot how to score, but because modern NBA team building punishes expensive, one-dimensional stars harder than ever before. If you're making superstar money now, teams expect versatility too. They want defense, durability, scalability, leadership, adaptability. And unfortunately for Beal, people started realizing he didn't bring enough of those extra things to justify the financial commitment anymore. That's why his reputation changed so dramatically. Because basketball-wise, Bradley Beal is still talented. He can still score at all three levels, create offense, and help teams offensively, but the contract completely changed how people viewed him. And honestly, that's the brutal reality of the NBA now. Sometimes a player doesn't even need to decline physically for their value to collapse. Sometimes the money alone is enough. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, subscribe to the channel to stay updated on new videos. As always, I'll see you boys in the next video.